And he sort of thought, oh yeah, dismissed it. Later on, the phone rang and it was Eric. He said, did you get my letter? I thought,
What secret battles were hidden behind the radiant face that sparked the greatest love songs in rock history? At 81, Pattie Boyd's story transcends beauty and fame. It is a tale of heartbreak, survival, and the heavy price of being a muse to legends. Stay with us as we reveal the haunting truths she carried beyond the spotlight. From Somerset girl to London icon. Pattie Boyd's story begins in the small market town of Taunton, Somerset, where she was born on March 17, 1944. Few could have imagined that this quiet English girl would one day be swept into the turbulent heart of the world's most famous musical revolution. Her childhood was marked by both upheaval and adaptability. After her parents separated, her mother remarried and the family moved frequently, exposing Pattie to different schools and environments. These shifts demanded resilience from an early age, a quality that would later define how she navigated the storms of her adult life. By the time she reached her late teens, Pattie had begun working as a trainee at Elizabeth Arden's salon in London. While it may have seemed like a modest step into the working world, it was there that fate intervened. Customers and colleagues began to notice her striking looks and natural poise. In the early 1960s, London was buzzing with cultural change, and photographers and talent scouts scoured the city in search of new faces that could represent a youthful, modern Britain. Pattie was soon spotted and invited to try modeling. This chance encounter would alter her path forever. Within a short time, she signed with a top modeling agency and started appearing in fashion spreads. Magazines such as Honey, Vogue, and Vanity Fair featured her fresh-faced beauty. Photographers loved her ability to shift between innocence and sophistication, a quality that captured the spirit of the times. She became one of the visual emblems of swinging London, a term that described the city's cultural explosion in music, art, and fashion. Her signature hairstyle, inspired by Brigitte Bardot, and her trend-setting outfits made her a style icon for young women across Britain. Pattie's career was not only about print spreads, she also worked in television advertisements and appeared in small acting roles. In 1964, she was cast as a schoolgirl in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first feature film. Though her screen time was brief, that role would bring her face to the attention of George Harrison, setting into motion the love story that would define much of her later life. At this stage, however, Pattie was still simply a rising model enjoying her place in London's cultural spotlight. What made Pattie stand out was not just her looks, but her adaptability to the shifting aesthetics of the 1960s. She could embody both the elegant couture model and the playful, rebellious dolly bird figure that defined youth culture. Designers such as Mary Quant saw her as a perfect representative of their designs, which emphasized miniskirts, bold colors, and freedom of expression. Pattie did not merely wear the clothes, she brought them to life in a way that made fashion feel accessible to young women everywhere. Her presence in the London scene also connected her with musicians, artists, and celebrities. Clubs like the Ad Lib and the Scotch of St. James became her social circle. She was at the very center of a movement that blurred the boundaries between music, art, and fashion. This was a world where chance encounters often led to lifelong entanglements, and for Pattie, the stage was being set for a meeting that would alter the course of her future. As Pattie's career blossomed, she began to sense the weight of her visibility. Though modeling brought financial independence and public recognition, it also carried pressures. Maintaining her image required constant vigilance, and the scrutiny of the press could be unforgiving. Yet, in those years, she appeared confident and luminous, unaware of the tragedies that lay further down her path. The young woman who began as a Somerset schoolgirl had transformed into one of the defining symbols of 1960s London. Her story was no longer just her own. She was stepping into a cultural moment that would link her forever with some of the most powerful voices in music history. But before all of that unfolded, a fateful introduction would draw her into a love story that millions would follow. What hidden forces turned her fairy tale marriage into heartbreak? Stay with us to uncover the details. The Beatle bride who inspired something. When Pattie Boyd first crossed paths with George Harrison, it was not at a glamorous party or on a fashionable runway. It happened quietly on the set of A Hard Day's Night in 1964, where she was playing a minor role as a schoolgirl. For George, the quiet and spiritually searching Beatle, Pattie stood out immediately. He was only 21 at the time, but had already achieved global stardom. Pattie, just beginning her career, suddenly found herself drawn into his orbit. Within days of meeting, George asked her out. She initially declined, being in another relationship, but eventually agreed. That decision marked the beginning of a love story that would soon be lived in the glare of the world's spotlight. Their courtship moved quickly. George was deeply smitten, and Pattie, charmed by his shyness, was drawn to the gentler side of his personality that fans rarely saw. In 1966, they married in a small ceremony in Surrey, attended only by close friends and family. Unlike the public spectacles surrounding other celebrity unions, theirs began with intimacy and quiet joy. Yet from the very first moment, the pressures of being attached to a Beatle began to creep into their private life. As the Beatles grew into the biggest band on Earth, Pattie became part of their inner circle. She traveled with them, met influential figures like Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, and witnessed firsthand the cultural revolution that the band was driving. To the outside world, she was living every girl's dream, a beautiful young woman married to a rock star at the peak of his power. Yet, behind the veil of glamour, isolation slowly began to take root. George's fame meant their movements were constantly scrutinized, and ordinary married life was nearly impossible. Despite these pressures, George's affection for Pattie was immortalized in song. His 1969 composition Something, often considered one of the most beautiful love songs of the era, was widely believed to have been inspired by her. The track became one of the Beatles' most enduring works, praised even by Frank Sinatra as the greatest love song ever written. For Pattie, however, being the subject of such devotion through music was bittersweet. While the world heard only romance, she knew the cracks in their relationship were already beginning to show. The shift began as George grew increasingly absorbed in spirituality and experimentation. His interest in Indian philosophy, meditation, and alternative lifestyles created a widening gap between them. Pattie tried to embrace his spiritual pursuits, traveling with him to India and studying meditation, but she often felt left behind. Reports from their time at Rishikesh with the Maharishi suggest that while George sought enlightenment, Pattie struggled with the austere environment and the demands of being a Beatles' wife in such a setting. Complicating matters further was the intrusion of temptation and infidelity. George's fame attracted admirers everywhere, and he sometimes succumbed to that attention. Pattie, for her part, felt increasingly neglected and lonely, despite the glamorous exterior of their life together. Friends later recounted how the two began living almost separate lives within the same marriage. The warmth and humor that had drawn them together were eroded by distance, spiritual pursuits, and personal failings. By the mid-1970s, the relationship was under severe strain. While George remained fond of Pattie, the marriage no longer offered her the love and stability she needed. The public only saw the perfect photographs, the stylish couple attending parties, the rock star and his muse. But in the quiet hours at Friar Park, their mansion in Oxfordshire, silence often filled the halls where love once lived. The tragedy of their marriage was not that it lacked passion or devotion at the start. Rather, it was that even the purest love could not withstand the weight of fame, spiritual distance, and betrayal. Pattie had become the wife of a Beatle, the inspiration for songs sung by millions, yet inside her own heart, she was slowly losing the man who had once seemed to be her anchor. What happens when devotion from one man turns into obsession from another? Come with us to find out more. Layla, the love triangle that shook rock. The rock world of the 1970s witnessed many dramatic entanglements, but few rival the triangle between George Harrison, Eric Clapton, and Pattie Boyd. What began as a friendship among musicians spiraled into one of the most turbulent love stories in modern music history. At its center was a woman caught between devotion, neglect, and the overwhelming attention of two of the era's most powerful guitarists. Eric Clapton had long admired George Harrison's artistry, and the two musicians collaborated often, sharing stages and even recording together. But behind the camaraderie, another force was quietly building. Clapton, already struggling with heroin addiction and feelings of isolation, developed an intense infatuation with Harrison's wife. He confided to friends and even to George himself that he was in love with Pattie. Unlike a fleeting crush, this obsession consumed him and began to shape his songwriting. The clearest expression of his torment was the 1970 album Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs, recorded with his band Derek and the Dominoes. The title track, Layla, was a desperate cry of unrequited love, its searing guitar riff and anguished lyrics leaving no doubt about the intensity of his desire. The name Layla was borrowed from a Persian poem about forbidden passion, a symbolic mask for Pattie's identity. For listeners, it was a groundbreaking piece of music. For Pattie, it was a reminder that her private life was being laid bare through songs that would echo across generations. At first, Pattie resisted Clapton's advances. She was still married, still trying to hold together her relationship with George despite the fractures. Clapton's persistence, however, became impossible to ignore. He declared his love openly, even writing her letters in which he confessed both his yearning and his despair. His struggle with heroin deepened as Pattie rejected him, and he withdrew from public life for a time. Friends recall how his fixation drove him into a spiral of substance abuse, using drugs and alcohol as a substitute for the affection he could not win. This love triangle played out not in whispers, but in full view of the artistic community of London. Musicians, producers, and insiders knew of the tensions, and many saw it as a collision of egos and emotions that was bound to end painfully. Pattie became the silent axis of the storm, burdened with the knowledge that her presence was driving both men into extremes, one toward withdrawal and infidelity, the other toward addiction and obsession. By the mid-1970s, her marriage to George Harrison had fractured to the point of no return. The distance that had grown between them left Pattie vulnerable to Clapton's renewed pursuit. Eventually, she gave in to the force of his devotion, leaving George and marrying Eric in 1979. But rather than resolving the turmoil, the new relationship created its own brand of tragedy. Clapton's struggles with alcohol and fidelity made the marriage deeply unstable. The dream of finally winning his muse turned sour as the reality of everyday life proved harsher than the fantasies painted in music. In hindsight, the Layla saga is remembered as one of rock's most intense stories of passion. It produced unforgettable art, but left scars on the people involved. What music lovers celebrate as a classic album was, in reality, a soundtrack to private suffering. Pattie found herself immortalized once again, this time as the embodiment of unattainable love. For Clapton, the song brought him fame, but not fulfillment. For George, it was a bitter reminder of betrayal by both wife and friend. The triangle revealed a darker truth about the era's music scene. Women who inspired great songs were often treated as symbols rather than human beings with their own needs and pain. Pattie was elevated as a muse, but often silenced as a person. Her story during the Layla years is not just about passion and rivalry, but about the heavy toll of being placed at the center of men's desires and artistic ambitions. What unseen scars surface when the applause fades and life's private struggles demand center stage? Stay with us to see what follows. Behind closed doors of addiction and loss. The image of Pattie Boyd has often been framed by magazine covers, photographs, and immortal songs, but the story behind those images speaks of a private life marked by wounds that could not be concealed. Fame can immortalize beauty, yet it rarely shields against pain. For Boyd, the tragedy lay in how her struggles unfolded, not in isolation, but in the shadow of two of the most celebrated musicians of the 20th century. Her marriage to Eric Clapton appeared to many as a fairy tale pairing of muse and genius. Yet beneath the surface, the relationship was scarred by his dependence on alcohol and drugs. Clapton's addiction shaped their daily lives, creating an atmosphere of volatility and instability. Friends who visited their home recalled moments where calm dinners could quickly spiral into chaos, with alcohol amplifying his frustrations and insecurities. For Boyd, these episodes were not isolated incidents, but patterns that defined much of her marriage. Accounts from her memoir and interviews describe instances of verbal cruelty and physical intimidation. These episodes challenged the glamorous picture that fans imagined. Behind the music and the applause, she was enduring an environment where tenderness was replaced by unpredictability and affection often dissolved into aggression. The cycle of reconciliation and relapse, so common in relationships affected by substance abuse, became a recurring theme in their marriage. Layered on top of this turmoil was the heartbreak of unfulfilled hopes for motherhood. Boyd longed for children, but her efforts met with painful obstacles. She endured miscarriages and pursued in vitro treatments at a time when such procedures were far less advanced and far more emotionally grueling than they are today. Each failed attempt deepened the emotional strain, adding grief to an already fragile bond. The absence of children was not just a private sorrow but also a fissure in her marriage to Clapton, as the shared disappointment often turned into blame and further distance. This combination of addiction, abuse, and reproductive struggles reveals a painful truth. The life of a muse is rarely as romantic as it appears. To the public, Boyd was a figure of inspiration, the woman who sparked something, Layla, and Wonderful Tonight. But to live as a muse meant being reduced to a symbol, her personal pain overshadowed by the art it inspired. She was celebrated as the source of genius, yet her own needs were often silenced. The cost of being a muse is not simply the loss of privacy, but the erosion of identity. Boyd has spoken about how she often felt invisible, her own voice drowned by the legends of the men around her. Songs written about her became global anthems, but her real life, the miscarriages, the abusive episodes, the quiet despair, remained unseen until she herself chose to reveal it decades later. By the late 1980s, the weight of this suffering could no longer be ignored. Boyd left Clapton, marking the end of a marriage that had begun with passion but dissolved under the pressure of addiction and unmet hopes. The divorce was not only a legal separation but also an emotional liberation, a breaking away from years of being defined by someone else's needs and struggles. The complexity of her experience challenges the myth of the muse as a figure of beauty and inspiration untouched by hardship. Boyd's story forces a reckoning with how the music industry and its audiences often consume the image of women without acknowledging the human reality behind it. She was at once adored and overlooked, immortalized in song, yet burdened with scars that the music never revealed. Her later candidness, in interviews and in her memoir, brought these wounds into the open. By speaking about the miscarriages, the abusive dynamics, and the loneliness of being trapped in marriages to men idolized by millions, she reframed herself not as a silent figure in someone else's legend, but as a survivor with her own narrative. This act of reclaiming her story added nuance to her public image, making her not just a muse, but also a witness to the darker intersections of art, fame, and private suffering. The tragedy of Pattie Boyd at 81 is not simply the loss of youth or the fading of glamour. It is the memory of how much was endured behind closed doors, of how inspiration was intertwined with injury. To understand her is to confront the uncomfortable truth that beauty and art often coexist with pain, and that the songs remembered by the world were born from wounds borne by one woman in silence. What secrets linger when the world only remembers the music but not the cost of its creation? Let us tell you. From muse to photographer and author, the aftermath of broken marriages could have left Pattie Boyd defined solely by the shadows of rock history, but instead, she turned toward creation and reinvention. What had once been a life spent in front of cameras gradually shifted behind them. This transition was more than a career choice. It was an act of taking back authorship in a story long dominated by others. Photography became her first form of reclamation. Instead of remaining the subject of endless lenses, Boyd began to capture the world through her own. She carried her camera not to preserve her image, but to reinterpret her surroundings. Exhibitions of her work revealed glimpses of musicians, artists, and intimate settings often unseen by the public eye. While audiences had long consumed images of her beauty, now they encountered her perspective, framed with quiet authority. In this role, she was not an accessory to fame, but its interpreter, shaping narratives rather than serving them. The publication of her autobiography further deepened this act of control. Released under two different titles, Wonderful Today in the United Kingdom and Wonderful Tonight in the United States, the book offered an insider's account of cultural eras that had been mythologized for decades. Critics noted how her voice in print contrasted sharply with the silent, idealized figure she had once represented in magazines and songs. Instead of being spoken for, Boyd spoke for herself, recounting not only the chaos of her relationships, but also the texture of her own experiences. Readers discovered not just the familiar drama of celebrity marriages, but the quieter reflections of a woman attempting to chart her own sense of meaning amid spectacle. Her exhibitions and books were not merely about memory, but about agency. To curate photographs, to select which stories would appear in print, was to shift the balance of power. Where once her image had been traded, copied, and commodified by others, now she chose what to reveal and what to conceal. Audiences who attended her exhibitions often remarked on the intimacy of the images, which contrasted with the larger-than-life legends surrounding their subjects. Through her lens, icons became human again, friends, colleagues, moments frozen without fanfare. This act of reinvention extended beyond personal art. In later years, Boyd connected her creative skills with philanthropy. She contributed to projects that highlighted refugee voices, recognizing the power of storytelling in reshaping how marginalized communities are perceived. By pairing images and narratives, she brought visibility to people whose experiences often remained hidden. This step marked a profound shift from the narrow role of muse to the broader responsibility of advocate. Her platform, built initially on being someone else's inspiration, was redirected toward amplifying others who lacked representation. Charity involvement allowed Boyd to bridge two worlds: the glamorous past of music and fashion and the urgent present of humanitarian need. She participated in fundraising events, lent her name to campaigns, and offered her creative talents to projects centered on dignity and empathy. The same woman once photographed for her looks was now using her vision to ensure others were seen. Her later years as photographer, writer, and advocate reflected a kind of quiet resilience. Reinvention did not erase the wounds of the past, but allowed them to be transformed into sources of perspective. To craft books, to mount exhibitions, to support storytelling initiatives was to demonstrate that even lives overshadowed by myth could find fresh expression. This was not a retreat into nostalgia, but a forward-looking embrace of possibility. Audiences responded with curiosity and respect. Reviews of her autobiography praised its candor, and exhibitions of her photography drew attention from both critics and casual visitors who were eager to see history reframed. The reception showed that there was interest not only in Boyd as a figure remembered from songs, but in Boyd as a creator whose work stood on its own terms. Her reinvention carries a lesson about the durability of identity. To live as a muse is to risk being forever reduced to someone else's story. Yet Boyd demonstrated that reinvention can reclaim space, giving new meanings to old roles. Through art and charity, she constructed a legacy that did not depend on the men who once defined her in public imagination. Instead, it rested on her own choices, her own eye, and her willingness to use her platform in service of causes beyond herself. What happens when private creativity becomes a public act of renewal? Let us take you through the secrets. The auction of secrets and memories. When personal artifacts leave private drawers and enter public bidding rooms, history becomes something tangible and transactional. In 2024 and 2025, letters and mementos from Pattie Boyd's life surfaced in auctions that reignited global fascination. Auction houses presented handwritten letters from George Harrison and Eric Clapton alongside postcards, photographs, and personal effects, transforming intimate correspondence into commodities that collectors could purchase. The marketing of these items leaned heavily on the mythology of music history. Letters were described not just as keepsakes, but as fragments of legendary love stories, evidence of the passions and pains that inspired some of rock's most enduring songs. Bidders were reminded that these were not generic signatures or mass-produced memorabilia. They were private words, written at moments of emotional turbulence. The very intimacy of these artifacts was their selling point. Press coverage treated the auctions as both cultural events and ethical puzzles. Journalists highlighted the raw tone of Harrison's spiritual reflections and Clapton's anguished declarations, noting how letters once meant for Boyd's eyes alone were now open to scrutiny. Critics raised questions. Does selling such correspondence risk reducing human vulnerability to spectacle? Or does it allow audiences a deeper, more authentic glimpse into history that shaped popular music? Collectors, meanwhile, saw opportunity. Some chased these items as investments certain to appreciate in value, while others regarded them as relics of cultural memory that could never be replicated. A few even argued that owning such letters was a way of safeguarding them from disappearing into obscurity, though skeptics countered that private ownership risked sealing them away from broader public access. For Boyd herself, the decision to release some of these materials has been interpreted in multiple ways. Some view it as pragmatic, a chance to manage finances and put value to items inevitably desired by collectors. Others suggest it was symbolic, an assertion that she, not others, should control how pieces of her life are dispersed. In this sense, the auctions were not only commercial transactions but acts of agency, allowing Boyd to determine how the relics of her past would circulate. The sales also triggered renewed debate over how women linked to male icons are remembered. Often reduced to muses, their own choices and legacies are overshadowed. By placing her archives on the open market, Boyd confronted this imbalance head-on. She forced the world to reckon not only with her role in music history but also with the idea that her possessions, her story, and her memories hold value independent of the men around her. The auctions, in that sense, became more than financial events. They were cultural reckonings, demanding recognition of a life that had too often been told through someone else's pen. Are these auctions acts of closure, or do they keep old wounds alive? Stay with us to uncover what comes next. The legacy of survival and silence. At 81, Pattie Boyd embodies both the resilience of survival and the silence imposed by decades of cultural framing. Her later life is not marked by retreat, but by ongoing engagement. She continues to present photography exhibitions, contribute to artistic projects, and support charitable causes. Even now, she curates elements of her archive, choosing how her image and story will persist into the future. The tragedy of her legacy lies in how narrow its framing has often been. For years, Boyd was spoken of mainly in relation to songs she inspired, rather than the work she herself produced. Muse became shorthand for her entire identity, eclipsing the reality that she built careers in modeling, photography, and writing. This reduction illustrates a broader pattern in cultural memory, where women linked to male artists are often remembered primarily through the reflections of others rather than through their own contributions. Yet her trajectory also demonstrates ways this narrative can be reshaped. By publishing her autobiography and mounting exhibitions, she shifted from subject to storyteller. By releasing certain artifacts into the public domain, she directed attention to her own voice. In doing so, Boyd has shown that legacies are not fixed. They can be revised, reclaimed, and reframed. She has also participated in public talks, festivals, and interviews, each moment offering her the platform to emphasize her own creativity and values rather than the men who once defined her image. What she deserves now is not only acknowledgement of her role as inspiration for legendary music, but recognition of her artistic and humanitarian endeavors. A forward-thinking reckoning would include serious study of her photography as cultural documentation, preservation of her writings as testimony of an era, and credit for her charity work as part of her public identity. Beyond admiration, it would involve ensuring she benefits materially and reputationally from the circulation of her archive, rather than watching others profit from her past. Only then can her story be seen in full, not as a shadow of others, but as a light entirely her own. Which part of Pattie Boyd's journey strikes you most deeply? Was it the turbulent marriages, the private battles with loss, or the way her own artistry was overshadowed by the men she inspired? Share your thoughts in the comments below.